The courtroom was filled with the usual hum of anticipation, papers rustling, whispers between lawyers, the shuffle of feet. Olivia Carter, as composed as always, stood silently in the back, waiting her turn. She wasn't nervous. She was used to the formality of the courtrooms. But this particular day felt different. There was an odd energy in the air, and for a moment, it had nothing to do with the case at hand. Judge Richard Collins, a middle-aged man with graying hair and an air of old-school authority, was reviewing his case files. He looked up briefly, then called out, "Olivia Carter." The name caught her attention, though it wasn't her case. He wasn't looking directly at her yet, but Olivia knew this moment, this encounter, was coming. It wasn't the first time she'd been mistaken for someone else or underestimated because of the way she looked. She knew how it worked, how people often judged her before they had the chance to know her. A young bailiff directed her to stand before the judge. Olivia straightened up, walking with purpose, her steps echoing against the marble floors of the courtroom. She had dressed simply but with deliberate precision, a neat navy blue blazer over a white blouse, a modest pencil skirt. She wasn't trying to make a statement with her attire. She was simply presenting herself as she was, a professional. Judge Collins, without lifting his eyes from his docket, spoke in a low, matter-of-fact tone. "Ms. Carter, you were caught speeding in a school zone. This is a serious matter." He paused, glancing up at her, and Olivia could see the judgment in his eyes. "The fine will be $250. Do you have anything to say before I finalize this decision?" Olivia swallowed the initial burst of indignation that rose in her chest. She had expected this assumption, this automatic presumption that she was just another person caught in the system, someone who didn't deserve much thought or second chances. She wasn't just any person. She was a judge, someone who had spent years in the very seat he sat in now. But she knew better than to react out of anger or frustration. Instead, she kept her voice steady and calm, her words carefully measured. "No, Your Honor," she said, her tone polite but firm. "I understand." Judge Collins nodded, satisfied. "Then the fine stands." "Thank you." Olivia gave a small, respectful nod of her own and walked out of the courtroom, the echo of her heels a stark contrast to the quiet buzz of the people who had been watching. She didn't flinch at the injustice. She didn't voice her frustration. But inside, something shifted. She wasn't just walking out of a courtroom. She was walking into something far bigger, and she knew it. As Olivia stepped out of the courthouse and into the crisp air, she felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the chilly breeze. The morning had started like any other, but now it felt different. The fine itself, though certainly unwarranted, wasn't the issue. What gnawed at her was how easily Judge Collins had dismissed her, how he had assumed she was just another person who didn't understand the law, just another individual who could be pushed through the system without question. She leaned against the cool stone wall outside, her fingers tightening around the small leather briefcase she carried. She had been through this before, judged not for her abilities or her experience, but for her appearance. As a black woman in a profession dominated by white men, Olivia knew all too well how people often didn't see her as an equal. She had worked for years to earn her place, climbing through the ranks in her district, and had built a reputation for fairness and unwavering dedication. But none of that mattered today in Judge Collins' courtroom. All that seemed to matter was the suit she wore, the color of her skin, and the assumptions he made before even considering her credentials. Olivia took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill her lungs. She wasn't angry. Anger wouldn't solve anything. But there was something stirring in her, a quiet fire, an unspoken determination. She couldn't let this moment go, not when it symbolized something much bigger than a simple speeding ticket. She had made a choice when she became a judge. She knew the challenges she would face, but she also knew how important it was for people like her to be present in positions of power. It wasn't just about her. It was about showing others who looked like her that they, too, could succeed in spaces where they had been previously excluded. But today had shown her that even with her title, her experience, and her expertise, there would always be people who saw her as less than. And that was something she couldn't ignore. As she walked back to her car, Olivia's thoughts turned to Judge Collins again. The way he had looked at her when he imposed the fine. There was a moment, just a brief second, where their eyes had met. It wasn't curiosity or recognition. It was judgment. She wondered how many times in his career he had made decisions based on assumptions, and how many people he had dismissed without realizing it. Olivia knew she would address this, but not in the way most people expected. She wasn't out for revenge, and she wasn't interested in making a spectacle. What she wanted was for Judge Collins, and anyone else who saw her as just another woman, or just another black person, to understand that she was not someone to be underestimated. She wasn't just a judge, she was the judge, and it was time for him to learn that. But how? The answer was simple, by showing him, and everyone else, exactly who she was. The following afternoon, Olivia was sitting in her office, reviewing case files, when she received a call from Judge Amanda Watson, a colleague she had known for years. Amanda was known for being warm and approachable, a stark contrast to some of the more standoffish figures in the legal community. She had a reputation for being open-minded and for advocating for diversity in the judiciary. "Olivia, are you free for a quick chat?" Amanda's voice was calm, but Olivia could tell there was something more on her mind. "Sure, come by any time," Olivia replied, setting her papers down with a sigh. She could feel that something was brewing, something she couldn't avoid. Amanda arrived shortly, her steps light and purposeful, as she entered Olivia's office. She immediately closed the door behind her, her expression serious. "I just wanted to reach out after what happened yesterday," Amanda began, sitting down across from Olivia. "I'm sure you noticed Judge Collins didn't quite recognize you." Olivia nodded, her expression neutral. She didn't need to say much for Amanda to understand what she was thinking. The exchange in the courtroom had been subtle but significant. Amanda continued, her voice lowering as she spoke. "I overheard him talking to a few colleagues afterward, and I could tell he had no idea who you were. He had no idea you were a judge, a fellow colleague. I think it's safe to say he made a quick judgment, and I don't think it was intentional. But I also think he needs to learn that not every black woman who walks into his courtroom is just someone off the street." Olivia didn't respond right away. Amanda's words hung in the air, but Olivia had already considered them. She wasn't angry with Collins, at least, not in the way Amanda seemed to expect. In some ways, his ignorance didn't surprise her. What frustrated her was the idea that someone in his position could have so little awareness of the bias they were carrying with them. Unsure he didn't mean to be disrespectful, Amanda continued, her voice still gentle. "But he needs to recognize it. And maybe this is the moment where that happens. Maybe this is the time when he sees that a black woman can be a judge too." Olivia's eyes met Amanda's. The sincerity in her colleague's voice was undeniable, but Olivia's mind was already spinning. She wasn't sure what exactly she was going to do next, but Amanda had made one thing clear. This moment wasn't just about her. It was about changing perspectives, challenging biases, and making sure that no one, not even someone in power, could continue operating under assumptions. "Thanks, Amanda," Olivia said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I'll handle it. But I appreciate you bringing this up." Amanda gave her a knowing smile before standing. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. We've got to look out for each other." As Amanda left, Olivia sat back in her chair, thinking deeply. She knew she had to confront this, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been overlooked, underestimated, or judged because of their appearance. This wasn't just about one judge's mistake. This was about a system that had allowed such ignorance to thrive unchecked for too long. And Olivia Carter was going to be the one to change that. The following morning, Olivia walked into Judge Collins' courtroom once again, but this time with a different purpose. She was no longer just a figure caught in the system. Today, she was someone who would make sure he saw her for who she truly was. The court was busy, as usual, with cases being called and lawyers going back and forth. She stood near the back, her eyes scanning the room until she saw Judge Collins presiding over a case in his usual manner, distant, authoritative, yet somewhat unaware. It didn't take long before the session ended, and Olivia made her move. She approached the bench, waiting for a break in the proceedings. As the court cleared, Judge Collins looked up, his expression shifting from professional to slightly puzzled. "Judge Carter," he greeted her, his tone polite but guarded. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon. Do you have another case today?" Olivia smiled softly, but her eyes held a quiet intensity. "Actually, no," she replied. "I wanted to speak with you for a moment, privately, if I could." His brow furrowed in confusion, but he gestured to a small office at the side of the courtroom. "Of course. Let's step into my chambers." The two walked into the small, cluttered room. As the door closed behind them, Olivia took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before speaking. She wasn't here to cause a scene, but she needed to make him understand, needed him to see her as an equal, as someone who commanded respect. "Judge Collins," she began, her voice steady and measured, "I wanted to introduce myself properly. I'm Olivia Carter, and I'm a judge in the neighboring district. I've been on the bench for several years now, handling cases and making rulings much like you do here." Collins blinked, his eyes widening as he processed her words. The realization that this woman standing before him wasn't just some defendant or random citizen slowly began to sink in. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Olivia didn't give him the chance to stammer an apology just yet. "I understand that my appearance may have led you to believe I'm someone without experience, but I can assure you, I've earned my seat just as much as you've earned yours," Olivia continued. "And while I appreciate your decision to impose the fine, I do want to point out that the assumptions you made about me, about who I am, and what I know, are part of a larger problem." Judge Collins swallowed hard, his expression shifting from surprise to discomfort. The silence between them grew heavy as Olivia's words landed. "I'm not here to accuse you, Judge Collins, but I do want you to recognize that in the future, this system, your decisions, can't be made on assumptions. We are all equals in the eyes of the law, and I'd appreciate it if you treated me as such," Olivia said, her voice calm but firm. For a moment, the judge said nothing, clearly at a loss for how to respond. Olivia let the silence linger, giving him the space to digest what she'd said. She wasn't angry, but the weight of the moment was undeniable. Finally, Collins cleared his throat, a hint of genuine remorse in his eyes. I didn't realize, Judge Carter. I'm sorry. I should have known better." Olivia nodded, acknowledging the apology, but not letting it be the end of the conversation. "It's a start," she said quietly, "but there's more work to do. For both of us." The next few days were a whirlwind for Olivia. She had settled into her usual routine, working through her docket, handling cases with precision and care. But the conversation with Judge Collins lingered in her thoughts. It wasn't just about the fine or the brief apology he'd offered in his chambers. It was about the underlying truths he had been forced to confront. The assumptions, the biases, the system that had allowed them to fester unchecked. Olivia wasn't sure what his next move would be, but she knew it wouldn't be the last time they would have this kind of conversation. On the fourth day after their meeting, Olivia received an unexpected call. It was from Judge Collins, and his voice sounded different, less confident, less authoritative. It was a tone she had never heard from him before. "Judge Carter, I've been doing some thinking," he began, hesitating as if carefully choosing his words. "I can't stop thinking about our conversation. You're right. I didn't realize how deep my assumptions went. I've been blind to a lot of things, and I can see how that's been a problem, not just for you, but for others too. I've been avoiding confronting it, but I can't anymore. It's not just about one incident. It's about the bigger picture, about how easy it is to overlook people, to make decisions without really seeing who they are." Olivia was silent for a moment, letting his words sink in. The fact that he was acknowledging his own biases was significant. It wasn't enough. Not yet, but it was a start. "Thank you for saying that," Olivia replied, her voice calm but with a note of approval. Recognizing it is the first step, but it's also about the actions that follow. What are you planning to do next? Judge Collins sighed on the other end of the line. "I don't have all the answers yet, but I'm starting with a public apology. I'll be addressing it in court next week. I know it's not going to fix everything, but it's the least I can do." Olivia nodded, even though he couldn't see her. A public apology wasn't a solution, but it was a start. It would show people that change was possible, that even someone in a position of power could admit their mistakes and take accountability. For Olivia, that was important, not for her own sake, but for everyone else who had been judged without cause, without understanding. "I appreciate that," Olivia said, "and I'll be watching. Not to hold you to your words, but to see if this moment of clarity turns into something real. People in our positions have a responsibility, not just to follow the law, but to uphold the values it stands for." There was a pause, and when Collins spoke again, there was a hint of resolve in his voice. "I understand. I'll make sure I do better from here on out." Olivia hung up the phone, a small sigh escaping her lips. She wasn't expecting miracles, but she knew something important had shifted, not just within Collins, but within herself too. She had fought for this moment, not just for recognition, but for change. And she was beginning to see that maybe, just maybe, change was possible after all. The following week, the courtroom was filled with the usual bustle, but there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. Word had gotten out that Judge Collins had something important to address. Olivia walked into the courtroom, taking her usual seat in the back. As she looked around, she saw several colleagues whispering among themselves. There was a buzz of curiosity. Everyone was waiting to see what Collins would say. Judge Collins, sitting at the bench, appeared more solemn than usual. His stern demeanor was replaced by an air of vulnerability that caught Olivia's attention. She wasn't sure how this moment would play out, but she knew it was significant. This wasn't just about one judge issuing a fine. It was about confronting a larger, deeply rooted issue. When the courtroom settled, Judge Collins stood and cleared his throat. The room fell into complete silence. For the first time, he wasn't just a figure of authority. Today, he was a man acknowledging his flaws, ready to be accountable. "Members of the court," Judge Collins began, his voice steady but lacking his usual confidence. "I've called this session today to address something that's been weighing on me for quite some time." His gaze swept across the room, but Olivia noticed how his eyes lingered just a moment longer on her, as though searching for something. "I recently made an error in judgment, not just in a specific case, but in my approach to the law and those who stand before me. In my decision-making, I let assumptions guide me, assumptions that have no place in our justice system." There was a brief pause, and Olivia could see that the room was tense. Judge Collins was still a figure of authority, but his words weren't those of a man defending his actions. They were the words of someone who had come to terms with his own limitations. "Last week, I had the privilege of speaking with Judge Olivia Carter," Collins continued, his tone more reflective now. "And through that conversation, I was confronted with the truth about my biases, how easy it is to overlook the experience, the knowledge, and the worth of others based on their appearance or background. That is a mistake, and it's a mistake I've made more than once in my career, but no more. From this day forward, I will work harder to ensure that everyone who steps into this courtroom is seen for who they truly are, not for the assumptions I may hold." Olivia watched as Collins spoke, noting how the room was still, the weight of his words hanging in the air. This wasn't just an apology. It was a declaration, a promise to change. He turned toward Olivia, his voice softer now, and with a trace of sincerity, he added, "I owe you a personal apology, Judge Carter, and I owe it to everyone who has ever been dismissed or underestimated because of biases that should have no place in our legal system." Olivia stood slowly, her heart beating a little faster. This moment, this admission, wasn't about winning or losing. It was about something far more important: the possibility of real change. "Thank you, Judge Collins," she said, her voice calm but filled with quiet strength. "I appreciate your words, and I hope they mark the beginning of a new way forward, for all of us." The room was silent for a moment before the soft murmur of applause filled the air. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like the start of something much bigger. The days following Judge Collins' public apology were filled with a quiet energy. Olivia could feel a shift in the courthouse, an unspoken awareness that had settled into the atmosphere. It wasn't just about Judge Collins' words. It was the ripple effect they caused. His admission had set something in motion, a subtle but powerful change that everyone in the room felt. People were talking. Discussions had started, conversations about bias, assumptions, and the kind of justice they all wanted to see in the system. But while the courtroom seemed to have embraced the change, Olivia knew that this moment couldn't be the end. It had to be the beginning of something bigger, something more tangible. The apology was a step in the right direction, but real change meant more than just words. It meant taking those words and turning them into action. Olivia spent the next few weeks quietly observing. She watched how Judge Collins interacted with others, how he treated defendants, witnesses, and his colleagues. There were subtle shifts in his behavior. He listened more intently, asked more thoughtful questions, and even reached out to colleagues who were from diverse backgrounds to seek advice. It wasn't a complete transformation overnight, but it was progress. And in her eyes, progress was something worth acknowledging. But it wasn't just Collins who had changed. Olivia, too, had found herself in new spaces. After the apology, she had been approached by several colleagues who had never before sought her out. They wanted to know more about her experiences, her perspective, and what she thought could be done to improve the system. They were eager to listen, eager to learn. For Olivia, this was both a humbling and empowering moment. She had spent years fighting for a place at the table, and now others were asking for her voice. It felt like validation, but more importantly, it felt like an opportunity. One afternoon during a lunch break, Olivia found herself sitting with a group of young attorneys, most of them women and people of color, who had recently joined the courthouse. They spoke candidly about their own experiences navigating the system, the challenges they faced, and how often they had been overlooked. Olivia listened, offering guidance where she could, but she also found herself inspired by their resilience. These were the voices of the future, voices that would help shape the next generation of justice. "I think the real work begins now," Olivia said, pausing as she looked around at the faces of those gathered. "It's not just about one apology or one moment. It's about changing the way we all think, the way we all see each other in this system, the way we treat each other, from the people in the courtroom to the people outside of it." The group nodded in agreement, a quiet sense of unity settling over them. Olivia knew this wasn't just her battle anymore. It was a collective fight, and she was more determined than ever to lead the charge. Judge Collins' apology had sparked something, but it was the actions that followed that would truly define the future, and Olivia was ready to be a part of it. Several months passed, and the changes that Olivia had hoped for were beginning to take root. The courthouse had undergone a subtle transformation. Conversations about diversity, bias, and fairness had become more frequent. The staff was more engaged, more open to discussing the ways in which their unconscious biases had shaped their decisions, and how they could actively work to create a more just system. It wasn't perfect, but the progress was undeniable. Olivia had noticed the shift in Judge Collins as well. He was no longer the distant figure he once was. Instead of assuming, he took the time to ask questions, to listen to the stories of those who appeared before him. His decisions, while still firm, carried a newfound empathy that made a difference in the courtroom. It wasn't just Olivia who saw the change. Others in the courthouse had begun to notice too. The once quiet whispers of skepticism had turned into conversations of admiration. But perhaps the most significant shift had come within Olivia herself. The experience had opened her eyes to the power of voice, the power of standing up, not just for herself, but for others who had been overlooked or misjudged. She had always been a fighter, but now she felt the weight of her responsibility even more deeply. She wasn't just a judge in a courtroom. She was part of something larger, a movement toward a more inclusive, more equitable justice system. One afternoon, as Olivia was preparing for another busy day, she received a letter from the Judicial Council. It was an invitation to speak at a national conference on diversity and inclusion in the judiciary. They wanted her to share her experiences, to talk about the importance of confronting bias within the system, and how her conversation with Judge Collins had sparked a wider discussion across the courthouse. Olivia stared at the letter for a moment, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. This was the kind of change she had dreamed of, a conversation that started with a moment of discomfort, but had blossomed into something far bigger. She had inspired others, and in doing so, she had become part of a larger movement that could affect real change in the judicial system. The conference was held a few weeks later, and Olivia stood before a room filled with judges, lawyers, and legal professionals from across the country. She shared her story, the story of how a simple encounter, an unexpected encounter, had led to a shift in perspective. She spoke about the importance of seeing people for who they truly were, of questioning assumptions, and of recognizing the power and responsibility that came with being a judge. The applause that followed was warm, heartfelt, and long-lasting. Olivia knew that this was only one small piece of the puzzle, but it was a piece she had helped put into place. As she walked off the stage, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that the work she had started with Judge Collins had already begun to ripple outward. There was still much work to be done, but Olivia was more determined than ever to keep pushing for a system that saw everyone, not as their assumptions, but as who they truly were. And with that vision in mind, she knew the future was in good hands.